Before we get into the real meat and potatoes, training, exercises, we need to discuss our training environment. So this lesson is going to be specifically on manipulating the environment, the different variables that we have in play, and how we can change them to set ourselves up for success, to make things a little bit easier, a little more clear for our horses, and to make the training a little more smooth and streamlined and efficient so that we can get our results faster and in a way that is less frustrating, safer, all that kind of stuff for everybody involved. The first piece of our training environment is going to be the equipment that we use to train with. So on this slide, we'll go over briefly the different things that I'm going to show in this course, and then you guys are always free to modify this, use stuff that is already hanging around your barn that you could adapt to be used in this way, or you go out and go shopping if you want to. There's no hard rules here. We're just going to go over what I use and kind of my rationale behind it so that you can make an informed decision going forward. The first thing that we're going to use is a clicker. We talked about the clicker already and why this has some benefits over a verbal word or a verbal sound. The clicker is really crisp. It makes a very consistent noise. It's very clear for a horse who's just learning about clicker training, and it's clear for a human who's just learning about clicker training. So I highly recommend investing the $5 in a set of clickers off of Amazon or something. They're very inexpensive. And buy a few, because if you're anything like me, you'll set one down and it'll disappear or it'll grow legs and walk away. So having a few laying around so they're easy to grab is really helpful. Another thing we already talked about is the food pouch. We talked about the various different kinds, so I won't get back into that again, but we want something that's convenient. We want something that it's easy for you to reach your hand in and grab the food out when you need it. And we want something that's easy to clean because things get slobbery or things get left out in the rain, or you might be using a type of food that can get moldy and gross. We want to be able to clean it out when we need to. The third thing is going to be targets. We're going to use several different kinds of targets in this class, and you can get very creative with this. Almost anything can work as a target if you want it to. But we're going to use a target stick to teach the horse to touch and follow a target stick. And then that touch and follow the target stick is then a behavior we can use to create all kinds of behaviors from going forward, much more complex things. We're also going to use stationary targets. So we're going to teach a horse to touch a stationary target with their nose, and we're also going to have a type of stationary target that they can touch with their feet. So when you're thinking about things to use as targets, I want you to just be thinking about sturdy things or safe things that if the horse boops it too hard and knocks it over or steps on it in an awkward way, that we're not going to get caught up in some kind of accident that's going to happen. We want it to be a safe item that's not going to cause us any issues. So for my target stick, I buy them, or I have made some where I just buy like a pool buoy off of Amazon and stick it on a wooden dowel from like Lowe's or Home Depot. Or there's all kinds of ones you can buy. Shauna Karish makes a really nice telescoping one that has a clicker attached to it. That's my favorite. I thought that was worth the investment because I use it all the time. But when you're first starting out, you could strap a piece of pool noodle to a piece of PVC pipe. You could tape a water bottle to the end of a carrot stick. You could use a crop with a tennis ball on the end. Like, you can get really creative. I've seen people do all kinds of stuff. I've seen people use fly swatters. What you want is something that has one obvious end on it that's the clear choice of where to touch. Just like a plain dressage whip, for example, where it's all quite a similar width and it doesn't have a clear place to touch. That's kind of a confusing target stick. But if you stuck something on the end of your dressage whip, like on the handle end, and now it's something quite visible, then that would be a cool option to use. For our stationary nose targets, I use a lot of traffic cones. It's something that I have that I used for setting up various different training exercises already. I have those, so that's an easy thing to use. The larger ones where they're not as easy to knock over are a little better and they don't disintegrate in the weather quite as easily. But you could also, I see people attach like boat bumper float things to the fence, or I mean literally anything that's like an obvious thing that the horse could touch. You can attach it to the fence line, or it can be something freestanding. Again, we just want to think safety in the back of our mind when we're choosing things. And then the last piece is the hoof target. We're going to use a mat in this class. I use like old doormats most commonly because that's easy. It's a nice size. You can use a piece of a stall mat. You can use an old area rug. You can use anything you want. You could take tape and demarcate like a rectangle out on your barn aisle floor. It just needs to be visible and something clear that both you and the horse can see and that is safe for them to step on.
So here I've got 3 like overarching categories of things that I feel like are probably the most important for making your training environment effective. The first is safety. You guys know this, you work with horses. Safety is super important. And we're talking about safety for both the horse and the trainer. We don't want things that the horse could get caught on. We don't want things that the trainer could trip over and fall. Y'all know basic horse safety. I don't need to get totally into it here, but that is number 1. Second of all, our horse needs to feel safe in addition to actually being safe. We need the horse to be comfortable. We need him to be relaxed. You don't want him, worried about his friends and worried about whatever's going on around you at the barn. We need an environment that's calm, where the horse can be comfortable and relaxed and ready to focus on the training. The third thing here is we want an environment that is controlled. And by controlled, I don't necessarily mean small, but I mean an environment where you can manipulate the variables as needed, how and when you want, to make your training more effective. So variables that you might want to manipulate could be the size of your training area, could be what different tools or objects are in your training area. It could be, are there other people around? Are there other horses around? Are there cars driving by, tractors, whatever? Any of those variables are things that we want to be able to control when we're in our training environment with our horses. And that leads us to this very important concept that a change in the environment is a training criteria. So it's something we need to be intentional about training. It's not something that we just kind of hope for the best with. We need to slice these changes thin and think about ways that we can incrementally increase the difficulty as we're training a behavior with our horse. So you want to keep the environment more controlled, so more variables under your control and more variables set to an easier standard when we're teaching a new behavior, when maybe we're working on counter conditioning something that horse finds scary or aversive, or when we're working on creating a more complex behavior. Once you have those new behaviors going pretty well in a more simplified environment, that's when we start changing one variable at a time to a more complex step so that it becomes more and more difficult. So if you think about haltering your horse might be very easy in a stall where there's not many distractions, the barn is quiet, it's just you and the horse, and it's a small environment, so it might be very easy. But then haltering your horse on a windy day when the vet is coming and there's tractor work happening and there's 30 horses in the field and it's a 20-acre field, then that is a much more difficult environment for the same behavior of haltering the horse. We wouldn't expect a horse to go from just being comfortable haltering in a very calm environment to being comfortable haltering in a very hectic environment overnight. That's something we need to be really intentional about training incrementally and in thin slices to slowly build up to that more, hectic or scary or complicated environment. So we'll talk a little bit later more about generalizing criteria, but by adding in more distractions, different things to the environment, the more variety we can add into that, then the more generalized a behavior becomes. And so for something like haltering that you want to be able to do, you want to be able to catch your horse in pretty much any environment, especially if there was an emergency to come up. That's a really important behavior to generalize as much as possible. Think about how many ways you can change the environment, change the criteria to make that behavior as robust as possible.
A concept related to this whole idea of manipulating our environment and changing variables to help support our training goals is this idea of antecedent arrangements. So, this is a vocabulary term basically that I want you guys to be aware of so that we can all be speaking the same language and using the same vocabulary as you progress in your training and as you're kind of going along with positive reinforcement. It's just going to be a really important concept, and this is something that you'll see talked about a lot in various training platforms and groups and stuff. So, antecedent arrangements are ways in which we can manipulate the environment to enhance the likelihood of the behavior that we want occurring. We have three types of antecedent arrangements, and we are often going to use all three of them together in conjunction, but for learning purposes, it's really helpful to kind of break it out into the three different groups just so that we know what we're looking at. The first type is going to be a cue. So this can be an intentional cue that you have trained, or it might be a cue that the animal has taught themselves, like maybe they hear the rustling as you open a plastic bag and your dog knows that there's cheese in there and they come running in from the living room to the kitchen to get some cheese. Now, that's a real life example from my life, so maybe you guys can relate to that. So when we're using our antecedent arrangements, we might add a cue for a behavior we're looking for, or we might make sure we eliminate a cue for a behavior we're trying to get rid of. We also can use setting events. So this is altering the environment in order to make the right thing easy and the wrong thing hard.
So you guys may have heard this saying, especially related to horse training, which is make the right thing easy and the wrong thing hard. You might hear this a lot with kind of like traditional or more natural horsemanship kind of training. And sometimes it can be used to kind of encourage maybe a little bit of rougher handling than I would suggest. But in this case, we're talking about making the right thing easy and the wrong thing hard by manipulating our environment, by changing things about our training area to, first of all, limit the learner's choices so that instead of the horse having 500 different options of behavior they could give us, maybe now they have 10. And so that makes the odds of getting the right behavior much higher. It's also going to make the desired behavior hopefully the easiest choice. So if we are looking to get the horse to, I don't know, let's say if we're looking to get the horse to back up, something I really like to do to train that in the early stages is to walk the horse up into a corner of the fence so that their options are either back up or walk into the fence or walk into me. So back up tends to be the easiest choice there. It's most likely what's going to happen. So those are just kind of get your mind spinning there a little bit. We're going to change the environment. We're going to change where we're training in order to make the right thing easier and make the wrong answer more difficult.
The third piece here is motivating operations. So when we're talking about MOs, we're talking about changing the animal's motivation level in some way. So either we're going to increase their motivation to perform the behavior that we do want, or we might decrease their motivation to do something that a behavior maybe that we're trying to get rid of. So there are ethical and unethical ways to alter motivations. An unethical example might be making sure your horse is super hungry before asking them to do a behavior that is difficult. So they're so hungry, they'll do anything for the food. That's not a particularly ethical choice because that starts to become coercive. A more ethical choice might be um, not taking your horse from the field to do high intensity work when they are in the middle of a nap. So we know they're sleepy and they might prefer to do something calm and relaxed. So we would choose to do a more stationary behavior if we're going to do training time. Whereas if we know we're going to be doing something high energy, we're going to pick a different time of day when our horse is not in the middle of their midday snooze to work on training that behavior. The last thing I'm going to leave you guys with is this nice little graphic that explains a little more about antecedents and introduces this concept of ABC, because this is another thing you'll see talked about a lot in training circles. ABC stands for antecedent behavior consequence, and that's the order in which things are going to occur. So the antecedent occurs, could be a cue or a command, something in the environment, an emotional trigger, or some kind of training technique. It's going to cue the behavior to happen, and then the behavior is going to result in a consequence. The consequences are those four things that we talked about in our operant conditioning quadrants. Could either be good stuff happens, good stuff stops, bad stuff happens, or bad stuff stops. And so the consequence is going to influence how often that behavior starts to occur in relation to that cue. So that's where we have that quote there at the bottom. The most fundamental law of behavior is that consequences drive behavior. So it can sometimes seem like the antecedent is driving the behavior, and in a sense, maybe they are initially. But the consequence is going to determine how often the animal chooses that behavior when the antecedent presents itself in the future. So that's where our behavioral modification comes into play. Our ability to train our horses to do what we want them to do comes through our consequences. And so in this class, we're talking about using positive reinforcement in order to train behaviors. And so hopefully it's all kind of coming full circle for you here, that all these concepts are kind of fitting into place and all the puzzle pieces are fitting together for you. So now that we've gone through all the theory and we've talked about how to set our environment up for success and how to use antecedents to improve our training, I think we're ready to get into the actual training exercises. So I hope you guys are excited for that, and I will see you in the next video and we'll get started.